Welcome to this short video on the Balanced Scorecard model. Now, this is a really important model, a really useful one when you're coming to have a look at business performance and trying to evaluate whether your organisation or a particular strategy has done well. And what we're going to be doing in this video is essentially a quick introduction to give you the basic ideas that you can use going forward with this model. Now, the Balanced Scorecard is there to try and deal with a very specific strategic problem, which is how do we decide if our organisation is performing well? So as a business or as a charity or as any sort of organisation that you can think of, how do you know if you're doing well? Well, first of all, why do we actually care if the organisation's doing well? Well, first of all, it can affect the strategy that you choose or the strategy that you might decide to change to. If your organisation is currently underperforming, you may find that you need to do something new. So you might need to launch new products, you might need to change your pricing, you might need to think about downsizing your operations, whatever. But you'd still need to know whether you're performing well or not to decide whether your strategy is appropriate or not. Deciding if an organisation is performing well is also normally required by your investors. If you want to raise finance, whether it's from banks or whether it's from shareholders, the chances are they're going to want to have a clear idea about how your business is performing and whether that's acceptable or not. And finally, it's really important for employee management and motivation. Not only will your staff want to know if they're performing well, if what they're doing is the right thing for the organisation, but you'll often find that evaluating organisational performance really helps you decide whether staff get bonuses, get rewards, because it's part of seeing whether they've actually performed well in the period. So answering this question of how do we know if our organisation is performing well is actually a really important one. Now, there was a traditional way of trying to figure out if our organisation was performing well. And certainly it was an easy one if you were a business. For most businesses or companies, the question was simply, is profit going up? Are our profits looking healthy? Are they maybe higher than last year? And it was a really simple metric. Because if we said yes, if our profits looked good, they were going up, then that must mean we were doing something right. So our organisation is therefore a success. It's doing well. Whatever we're doing is clearly working. Alternatively, if profit wasn't going up, if it's dropping, or in some cases even if it's just staying static, then our argument was there was clearly something wrong. The business was underperforming. It wasn't doing as well as it maybe had done in previous years, and therefore that was a sign that we needed to change what we were doing. Now, it's very, very simple. It's very easy to understand as an approach. However, it's not actually a particularly good one. People started realising there were some really serious problems with this approach to evaluating company performance. Now, there are actually a number of different problems with that approach of just focusing on profit, but we're going to focus on one in particular. And that is that profit is a very short-term measure of whether we're actually being successful or not. Let's imagine an example. Let's say we run a chain of burger restaurants, fast food takeaway burger restaurants. We might have decided on a new strategy to try and boost our profits. So let's say we decide to switch to a cheaper supplier for all our raw materials, all our foodstuffs, and we're going to change our menu to only offer cheaper food options for customers. Now, in the short term, that is going to lower our costs. We're paying less for our raw materials, and therefore we should end up seeing quite quickly a boost in our profits, which is great. The problem is that we might be storing up problems for ourselves later on. So, for example, you might find that customers actually miss what was on the menu before. Maybe they don't like these new cheaper food options as much. So we might find that we gradually lose customers to our rivals. You might also find, because we've gone for cheaper raw materials, a cheaper supplier, that there may be poorer quality. Again, that could put customers off in the long term, or you might find that gradually we start finding that we waste more of our raw materials. Again, leading to kind of rising costs. So what we might end up with is a situation where in the really short term, what we've done has actually boosted profits. However, unfortunately, in the long term, it's led to loss of custom, rising waste and costs, and therefore it could actually reduce profits over, like I said, to the mid to long term. So only relying on the profits is often only going to give you this kind of distorted short-term view of whether your business or a particular strategy is performing successfully. So to try and deal with this problem, when we're trying to evaluate performance, a new model was developed by a couple called Kaplan and Norton, and they called it the Balanced Scorecard. And it's specifically designed to try and give a wider view of performance, or a wider view of whether your organisation or a particular strategy is successful. What Kaplan and Norton argued is there were actually 4 different perspectives. There were 4 aspects, if you like, towards success. There was a financial perspective, there was an innovation and learning perspective, an internal business perspective, and a customer perspective. So there were 4 different areas, if you like, that you needed to focus on as an organisation to properly evaluate your performance and decide if you'd done a good job or not. Now, what Kaplan and Norton argued is that while you had these 4 things, in actual fact, they all overlapped with each other. So, for example, if you were worried about customer perspective, and again, we'll look at these in more detail in a second, how your customers perceive you may well impact whether they buy goods from you, which could potentially impact your finances. So while we look at these as kind of 4 separate areas, in actual fact, you will find that there's crossover between all 4 of them. The idea, though, is if we consider performance from these 4 different perspectives, as an organisation, we set ourselves targets in each of those 4 areas, and we monitor how we perform in all 4. And that should give us a sense of whether we're overall, as an organisation, performing well or not. So the logical thing to do next is let's have a look at each one of these perspectives and try and get a feel for what sort of measures we might include as an organisation under each one. Now, it's important to remember as we go through each of these different perspectives that actually the measures that you would use under each perspective have to be tailored to your particular organisation. So every organisation will have a different set of targets that's appropriate to them within the Balanced Scorecard. What we're going to start off by having a look at is the financial perspective. Now, this is in some ways quite closely aligned to the idea of, are we making enough profit? It's just a more sophisticated version of that. Because ultimately, if we want to be successful, our organisation has to be financially viable. So as part of our gauging of whether we are a success or not, well, yeah, you need to figure out if you've got enough money or not. Now, let's go back to our idea of running a chain of fast food burger restaurants. What sort of things could we measure to see whether we are financially successful or not? Well, in reality, there's a whole range of possible things that we could use. We could set ourselves profit targets, whether kind of that's for total profit or you're trying to achieve kind of increased or better profit margins. We could set ourselves sales targets. We could look at certain key investor ratios like the return on capital employed or the return on investment. And you could even start having a look at things like share prices and dividends. Which ones of those we decided to use would very much depend on our particular circumstances and perhaps particularly what our investors were interested in as a business. But we could set ourselves targets in some or all of those areas, and the idea is if we hit our targets in each of those areas we've set ourselves targets in, then we are, by definition, financially successful from a financial perspective. The next perspective we need to consider is the customer perspective. Now, again, this is quite a logical thing to include as one of our measures of success, because ultimately, if we don't keep our customers happy, you're going to lose sales, and eventually you'll lose customers altogether. So if you've got unhappy customers, you can't really be a success. So the customer perspective, again, going back to our idea of running a chain of burger restaurants, how would we actually measure what customers think of us? What targets could we set for customer satisfaction? There are a number of different ways that you can measure the customer perspective. Again, these could involve things like sales. I know we mentioned sales under the financial perspective. Do be aware some measures can actually appear in more than one perspective quite reasonably. Or alternatively, what we could look at is market share. So the idea that, the bigger the market share we have of the burger market, presumably the happier customers are, the more people want to shop with us. You could measure customer satisfaction through things like survey results. We could look at the number of customers that repeatedly come back to us. Do we have how many regular customers do we have? Are we able to measure that? That might be a sign that they're either happy or unhappy with us if they're going to rivals instead. Any of those sort of things, anything to try and measure what customers actually think of us. And again, the idea is we set targets in some or all of those areas, and if we hit those targets, we must be keeping our customers happy, so we are successful as an organisation from the customer perspective. Next up, we have the innovation and learning perspective. Now, again, there's a logic in including this as a way of defining success. In most industries, you have to innovate, you've got to improve your offering on an ongoing basis, either to keep your costs down and make yourself as efficient as possible, or to react to what your competitors are doing, or how customer needs are changing over time. So what we want to do is check that from an innovation and learning perspective, we are being effective. So again, going back to our burger restaurant, how would we actually measure our innovation and learning and whether we're doing well enough in this area? Well, you could look at things like how much money or how much time do you have or spend on staff training. That could be a measure of innovation and learning. You could look at the number of new items that you put on the menu. I mean, if you're a manufacturing business, you could directly measure things like the number of new products. So for a burger restaurant, again, the number of kind of new products or services that you offer. There's often an argument within this category as well that actually innovation and learning, developing, training your staff tends to actually be quite a positive experience for them. So you can measure your innovation and learning capabilities by looking, perhaps more indirectly, at how happy your employees are. So you can also include under here employee satisfaction measures. Could involve, again, things like employee turnover. It could involve things like your employee satisfaction scores, again, if you do some surveys, something like that. And you can also measure things like employee productivity. So how hard are your employees working? Again, that will all be classed within this idea of keeping your staff happy as being a key part of innovation and learning, because ultimately it's your staff that are going to have to do all the innovating and all the learning for you as part of your organisation. So again, just to stress, the idea is if we set ourselves targets in those areas and we hit those targets, again, it must mean we are meeting the requirements to be a success within innovation and learning. Finally, we have the internal business perspective. This looks at how efficient we are as an organisation. The idea is, what do we need to do well at to keep customers happy? So again, it will potentially overlap a little bit with some of the other areas we've looked at, the financial perspective, the customer perspective, but that's absolutely fine. So if we look at being a fast food industry, like a burger joint or something like that, just like we have been doing before, what do we need to do well to please our customers? What internal things have we got to be good at? So you could look, for example, at, well, if we're a fast food restaurant, the food should really come fast. It should be quick. So what you could do is measure customer waiting time. If your restaurant is really inefficient and you're providing food slowly for customers, that's likely to show that you're not being particularly efficient, you're not being effective, you're not being successful internally, and that would have a knock-on impact on our customers' perception of us as an organisation. You could look at things like the number of returns and complaints. So how often are we actually getting people's order wrong? That could be an indication, again, that our internal processes are poor because we're making the wrong product or we're doing the wrong things for our customers. And you might even look at things like the amount of wastage. So how much of our food are we having to throw out? Either because we're not looking after it properly, we're not monitoring it properly, or because we're not storing it properly, or because we're not buying the right stuff. Any of those sorts of things, again, could lead to excess wastage, which gives us inefficiency and has a negative impact on our financial perspective. So look at what you do as an organisation and try and get a feel for internally what are the key things we could measure to see if we're actually making our product or delivering our service effectively to our customers. And again, we set ourselves targets in some or all of those areas, and the idea is if we hit those targets, it means we are successful from an internal business perspective. So that's just an idea of how you could use the Balanced Scorecard for a particular business, in this case a burger chain. In reality, like we said, in any sort of exam scenario or whenever using this for a real business in the real world, you would have to tailor these points precisely to the sort of organisation that you are looking at. Now, what we just need to look into briefly in a bit more detail is those targets that we've just discussed. So for each perspective, we said that there were some targets that we needed to set ourselves, or areas that we were going to target in each of them. Now, so far, most of those targets that we've set have been very high-level general things. If you want to be a little bit more specific, what you'll find is those targets under each of the perspectives are often broken down by businesses into CSFs, or critical success factors, and KPIs, or key performance indicators. So if we have a look at our burger restaurant again, when we were looking at this, we looked at, let's pick one of them. We went for the customer perspective as part of what we talked through. And one of the things that we said we were going to measure under the consumer perspective or the customer perspective was customer satisfaction. Now, this is an example of a critical success factor. It's quite high level, it's quite general. A CSF is just something that you need to be successful at in a particular area. So in this case, we need to have good, high levels of customer satisfaction to be successful. So we've identified as part of the customer perspective a critical success factor. The problem with critical success factors is they tend to be fairly general. So yes, we've got to keep our customers satisfied, but there's no indication in there how we actually do that. How do we measure customer satisfaction? You can't, you don't have a satisfactionometer that you can wave at a customer and try and find out if they're happy or not. So what we would do is we would take that high-level critical success factor and we would convert it into specific measurable targets. And those are our key performance indicators. So for example, if we wanted to ensure that we have good customer satisfaction, we might, for example, set ourselves a KPI of achieving 75% positive feedback on customer surveys. Okay, so we've got a specific number that we have attached to this particular target, if you like, and it's something we can physically measure, and that's what makes it a KPI. You'll often find that each CSF can have multiple KPIs. So let's say, for example, as well, that you aim to reduce customer complaints by 45%. If you manage to achieve that key performance indicator, then that would be a very good sign that your customers were satisfied. So the idea is that if you meet those specific KPI targets, you're meeting the goal of keeping the customer satisfied, which is one of the key aspects of the customer perspective. Okay, so there is a very clear link, hopefully, between the perspective, the critical success factor, that high-level target, and the specific things, the goals that we are aiming for, which are our KPIs. Now, sometimes people can find this all a little bit confusing, so just to stress it, let's take that point and look at it from perhaps a bit more of a charted point of view to make this easier. If we just take that one perspective, okay, of the customer perspective in the Balanced Scorecard for our company, we would break the customer perspective down into a number of CSFs, okay, high-level critical success factors. Tend to be fairly general, things like we just saw, customer satisfaction, and let's say service quality. So that one perspective could have several critical success factors that we need to monitor, if you like, in order to ensure that our customer perspective is a success. Each of those CSFs can then be broken down into specific key performance indicators that give us the underlying things that we can measure to make sure that the CSF is being managed successfully or is being accomplished. So we've already said for customer satisfaction, for example, we could set ourselves survey result targets for our customers. We could monitor the number of complaints. Both of those we can set ourselves numerical targets on, and if we achieve those targets, it means that we've achieved keeping our customers satisfied, which is our critical success factor. For service quality, we could measure the average wait time of a customer. We could look at the number of returns, so how many people were really unhappy with what we've given them and have actually sent it back to the restaurant. Both of those things together would give us an idea of service quality, and again, they are specific things that we can measure, so they are key performance indicators. So hopefully you can see what you actually end up with is you'll have a high-level perspective, which is then broken down into kind of general target areas that you want to do well to achieve that perspective, and then the CSFs are further broken down into specific key performance indicators that are the things that we can measure to ensure that we are achieving those different things, okay, those different CSFs and the overall perspective. So you can end up, like I say, with one perspective having a number of critical success factors, and each critical success factor breaking down into a number of key performance indicators that you'd focus on in your business. Now, the Balanced Scorecard is a really good model because it gives you a breadth of understanding about how well your company or your organisation is performing. However, it isn't perfect. Firstly, as you will have noticed from that last slide that we went through, you break each of your perspectives down into a number of critical success factors, which then break down, well, each critical success factor can break down into several key performance indicators. What that means is you end up with lots and lots of key performance indicators that you have to manage. You'll have basically loads and loads of different targets in each area that you are supposed to try and meet. That becomes very, very time consuming to monitor and very expensive because you're going to have to create systems to enable you to keep track of all these different things that you want to measure, from customer surveys to returns to sales to employee surveys. All of these things will have to be managed, monitored and checked on a regular basis. So it'll take up a lot of management time. In addition, having all of these different KPIs and targets can be really confusing for managers. If you have 100 different key performance indicators that you are measuring to see whether you're being successful, well, how do you know which ones are important? I mean, some of them surely will be more high priority than others, but how do you decide that? You may not be able to actually manage to fulfill all of those different targets, and if you don't have the time or the money to do all of them, which ones matter the most? Well, it's really hard to say. And in actual fact, even more confusingly for managers, what you'll often find is your targets may actually contradict each other. So, for example, we might set ourselves a target under the financial perspective to maximise our profits in the year. However, unfortunately, we also have things like learning and innovation where we should be spending money training our employees and keeping them happy. So, which one wins? Do you spend money on training and innovation, or do you just save that money to boost your profits? So again, which is the important? Which one wins? That the model doesn't really say. The other kind of final big problem with the balanced scorecard is that what if you're successful in one area but not another? So what if your customers are really happy but you're not entirely financially successful? What if you hit all your targets for the internal business perspective but you've not been really innovative in the year? Well, are you successful or are you not successful? It's hard to say. We drill down into so many different targets and ideas here. Actually, you never really get a yes or no answer about whether your business is a success or not. It's probably just worth mentioning as well, sometimes people argue that the balanced scorecard is also a problem because it sets us targets and goals as an organisation, but it doesn't specifically include things like environmental and ethical considerations, which are increasingly important for organisations to build into their view of whether they've been successful or not. You can build it in, so it is something that you could consider building into the balanced scorecard as you go, because for example, you might find that your customers are really interested in whether you are an ethical business. So that could be part of the customer perspective, for example. But it's not kind of explicitly in there, and that is sometimes seen as one of the drawbacks of the balanced scorecard as well. So it's a really useful model. It's a really good structure. It's very commonly used in the real world, but do remember there are some problems with its use.